All right, so here we go. So this is it. This is session 12. And we're skipping the review online this time. And I'm guessing it's somewhat difficult for people to actually do it, make time to do it offline. But I think it's really a good practice to do reviews of things like this. I do it all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm always amazed at how much I missed the first time or how different I am the next time I encounter the material because time has passed and my brain has changed. All right. So this is my attempt to take everything that or most of the things that we've covered over the last 11 sessions, and to try to bring it to a kind of integrated whole, right? And I'm using the title here, Using Our Brain to Turn a Life into Living Art, all right?
That's great.
Because that's what I think happens as it certainly feels like it's happened for me as I've taken this knowledge and actually applied it in my life, all right? So here's one of my great brain picture finds. Striped toothpaste. I can see the amygdala in there and the prefrontal cortex and the visual cortex, and there's the temporal lobes there on each side. And slide 2, you see it there?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really, well, we're going to look at the ways that some people who study brain science for a living actually do think of it in terms of art and actually make art out of it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So then I asked you to watch these short videos of Christopher Deschamps and David Linden.
They were really interesting.
I mean, the things that brain scientists are actually being able to creatively accomplish based upon their understanding of how the brain works are magical in many respects. I don't think we looked at how Ramachandran at the University of San Diego used a simple hardware store mirror to end phantom limb pain for patients. It's just really, he understood that the limb pain was a function of something going on in the brain that could be corrected. And he found a simple way to do it.
So just by having people actually look in the mirror and acknowledge?
No, it's worth going into a little bit here. So here's what happens. So in phantom limb pain, if you lose your limb by trauma, what often happens is, let's say your arm gets blown off in war.
Right.
The brain contracts in response to that insult, right? It contracts the arm.
Yeah.
Because of the pain and the shock and that whole experience. Well, at that point, when the arm's gone, the neurons in the brain are reacting and place that arm in a contraction mode, right? Except that the lower part of your arm is not there anymore. So you can't uncontract it.
Oh.
Right? So here's what Ramachandran did. He took a mirror and he had soldiers stick it in their armpit. Say if you lost your left arm, he would have them stick it in their left armpit. So now there's just a mirror and there's no arm there, right? And then he would have them bring their right arm into view in the mirror. So now they're looking in the mirror, they see their real right arm, and in the mirror what they see is a reflection of their right arm, but it looks like their left arm. And so essentially what he does is he has them flex their right arm, And the brain and the visual cortex are picking up cues from the mirror that begin to activate the wires that used to control the left arm and are releasing the contracted, the neurons that make the arm contract.
Wow.
Isn't that cool?
Amazing.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
So yeah, go online, look at mirror box, phantom limb pain. Just type those words in and you'll see it.
Okay.
But that's just one example of so many innovations that neuroscientists are coming up with to help relieve suffering in the world.
Huh.
All right, and then David Linden, I really like his books and the way he writes and thinks about the brain. And he's right. You know, this thing is, when you think about it, it's not that. Well, first of all, it's an extraordinarily designed organ, collection of cells that are able to function together. But it's also a kludge of things just stuck together.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do is decipher how this, this Rube Goldberg contraption actually functions and find ways to actually improve its function.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think in the talk that Jeff Lichtman gave, the professor from Harvard, where he said, we're 3 inches into a mile-long journey.
Right.
Yeah, I think he's right. And it's exciting to see where we're going to ultimately go. All right, let's see what we have on slide 3. So I haven't actually looked at this slide deck in probably a week. So I'm going to be surprised as you folks will be. So again, I've organized it with 12 questions. And they're the questions that ideally I would be asking if I were you and knew what I know. All right? So here are the 12. I'm not going to read each of them. I'm just going to scroll through them. All right. Last one there. Okay, so the first question is, what are optimal neural environments for a life lived as art? And I put this famous quote up from Einstein because I think he really understood his own brain probably mostly and was extrapolating a lot from that. So he recognized essentially that there are 2 hemispheres and they each function differentially, and that both sides are important, but we've gotten out of balance, right? And we continue to get out of balance, and that imbalance is causing a lot of suffering and disharmony in the world. So he says, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So this was a really interesting quote for me for a number of reasons. And one is, when I finished my bachelor's degree, I applied to graduate school, and I ended up enrolling in and dropping out of 5 different graduate schools. Yeah, it's funny.
I love that.
And
I dropped out of 3.
there you go. And I bet we dropped out for the same reason, Ruth.
I bet we did.
The reason for me was it didn't resonate.
Right.
The subjects and the professors really I didn't resonate with. And the reason I didn't resonate with them was because they reflected this rational, linear, logical, left brain imbalance. And I had plenty of that. And I didn't feel like it was serving me that well. So the school I ended up actually going to was an experimental school started by two guys, one from Stanford, one from Harvard, who thought that they actually got only a partial education, that they didn't have, that their right brain wasn't educated. And their emphasis was on experiential learning, mostly things oriented to the right brain, which was a which was a ton of fun, and almost everyone in all the classes that I was aware of at the time ended up graduating after 2 years with twice the credits they actually needed. For two reasons. One was the way the tuition was structured. It was a flat fee tuition. You didn't have to pay by the credits. And you could get credit for things that you could take as independent electives. So students would organize a trip to Death Valley on a vision quest and get credit for it. They could spend a month at a Zen center up in Mount Shasta and get credit for that. You wanted to learn about Buddhism, for example. I enrolled in a grief counseling training and was a volunteer grief counselor for those 2 years, and I got credit for that. So this was a great way to learn, and to learn in community, because we were all basically responsible for what it was we wanted to actually learn. All right, so Albert kind of recognized that long ago, but you really have to seek out places to have your right brain educated. All right. So what are optimal neuroenvironments for a life lived as art? And I wrote here, it really depends on where you are along a developmental trajectory. And so basically, it's what we were just talking about, and that is, if you have an over-educated left brain, you're really better served in pursuing right brain education, quote unquote, and vice versa, right? Many of the students who came to our school, and I was required to serve on the admissions committee for 2 years, had an overdeveloped right brain. And so they were best served by being gently directed to improve their cognitive and logical capacities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. It's like, well, does that mean you have to really look for the other side? You do.
Yeah.
'Cause I know a lot of people that are like what you're talking about, just totally creative and intuitive, but not very functional.
Right. You need to have this balance, and the balance is an integrative one. And what's interesting is you can actually see integration take place if you look under in a functional MRI scanner. You can actually see the corpus callosum, this band of wires, essentially, that goes between the two hemispheres, increase in number and strength of signaling across the hemispheres.
But isn't it hard to find ways to work that if you're super right brain, to be able to really function more in the left?
Well, it is hard, and it's painful. And it's something that, people don't develop one side or the other by accident, right? We develop one side or the other because it feels the best for us to turn toward. Right? When we're taking a math class as a little kid and we struggle in math, suddenly math becomes something that feels really aversive to us, and we don't want to go there. But all it takes is a skilled math teacher who really understands our struggle and more importantly, makes us feel seen and felt and not stupid. And kids will, like, do everything they can to perform for a teacher like that.
Mm.
This is actually what we're trying to train doctors on this weekend. Your patients will do everything they can and perform for you in service of getting themselves well if they feel like you really get them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I also, at the bottom here on slide 4, we have safe, predictably unpredictable, and have free time where we can sustain open awareness.
Mm.
Right? The press and crush of busy lives is really antithetical to integration, in my experience.
Mm.
We really need safe places, places where we can stretch a little and grow. And as I think about it, that was what many of the people were saying at this weekend workshop, that this was missing from their lives. Yeah, so these are a few. So let's look at slide 5. How important is neuroception to a life lived as art? So remember, neuroception is our body's ability to detect threat and not be consciously aware of it. All right?
Mm-hmm.
So this was really interesting. So at this narrative medicine class that we just did, the first, 45 minutes we spent having a discussion of safety. And we basically asked people if they'd ever felt like they had an adverse experience in a public or private classroom. And everyone raised their hands. Right? They were unanimous in their agreement that classrooms can be really dangerous places. Right?
I would agree.
Yeah. And not maliciously or intentionally. It's just you put a collection of people together in various states who've experienced all different kinds of adverse childhood experiences, like we're depicting here. And you're going to get this organization, you're going to get, a high probability of people having difficulty and not being able to skillfully channel it. I've always thought that the idea of grouping kids in middle school all together without one-on-one supervision for every kid was a really bad idea from a brain perspective.
Yeah.
Right? Because they don't have executive function control. They don't have very good integration.
Mark, when we in the scholarship program that I ran, there were 80 students, and we met with them individually. 2 of us met with them individually 4 times a year.
Yeah.
And that there were 27 other scholarship programs, and our retention rate was 97%, and the one closest to us was 62%.
Uh-huh. So how?
It was that safety of being able one-on-one to talk that was all the difference.
Right. Yeah, and knowing that they have you available to.
Yes.
I mean, how I would think of it is to answer the big brain question for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we kept notes so that we made sure that things we covered in the first session got caught up in the second, and had them for 4 years. So,
right.
And it really was the single difference in our program and the 27 others.
Yeah. So basically, your program in that school, this is at Davidson.
Yes.
Yeah. So your program is a place where people really want to come to school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that was how my graduate school was when I finally found the place I felt most at home at. I really wanted to be there.
Yeah. We had to fight for it. No one wanted the administrative time that it took. They didn't want us to do that.
Right. Yeah. So
I mean,
change
because
is hard.
left brain, you got to be doing something constructive,
Right.
not talking.
Right. Exactly. All right. So then at the bottom of slide 5 here, I have this wisdom directive to become as little children. And it's not to become as little children who have suffered adverse childhood experiences, but to become as little children before that, right? Because who we were before these disorganizing experiences happened to our neurophysiology lives in us and is often calling us back to it. I'm reading a really fascinating book now, and I highly recommend it. It's by Mark Epstein. It's called The Trauma of Everyday Life. And it's a developmental neurobiological look at Buddha's early life and how his adverse childhood experience drove his whole exploration, his whole search for pain relief, basically. And the pain that he was trying to relieve was a neuroceptive pain, and it lived in unconscious process. It lived in, buried in his neurophysiology, in his brain and in his body. And it was the loss of his mother 7 days after he was born. An abrupt rupture of that relationship. And it's just a really fascinating account how when he experiences so-called enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, what he's actually, according to Epstein, what he's actually experiencing is a refiring of the neurons that held memory of what life was like when he was in his mother's embrace before she died. Yeah. Okay. Slide 6. Slide 6. Okay. So here's I'm back to slide 5. I have a hyperlink. If I was to click on it, it would take you to this recent research that's showing how learning drugs can reawaken a grown-up brain's inner child, right? So this is, a lot of research is into drugs, which are interesting and often useful, at least for short term. But in my estimation, what drugs tell us is that the brain inherently has the capacity that drugs are adding, right? We have the capacity to reawaken the grown-up brain's inner child without drugs. And so ideally, that would be my preferred way to go. But drugs can be an interesting experience to sort of like wake us up to that possibility. I remember, I may have mentioned this before, Ram Dass was, the spiritual teacher, was once asked, he and Timothy Leary pioneered drug taking at Harvard, for which they got kicked out. And somebody asked him, what is it that you learn from taking drugs? And Ram Dass said, well, what I've learned is that it's taken me my whole life to try to integrate what I discovered after I took these drugs. So, he had his mind and brain temporarily opened up to these potentials and possibilities. And then without the drugs, he wasn't able to actually continually access them. And so that eventually led him to, explore a whole, much like Buddha, explore a whole series of ascetic practices and indulgent practices, and then eventually come to some sort of middle path. There was neither of those, and probably needs to be individually, uniquely our own. That's my best sense. So, and actually, it's kind of confirmed by Andrew Newberg's research on when he interviewed, hundreds of people who identify themselves as being religious. And after performing hundreds of interviews, what he discovered was, everybody practices their own religion in ways that are absolutely unique to them. So every Christian is uniquely Christian. Every Jew uniquely practices Judaism. Every Buddhist uniquely and individually practices Buddhism. And so I was thinking, well, basically what he's saying is that if Ruth wants to practice a spiritual practice, it'll be Ruthieism. And if Elaine wants to, it'll be Elaineism.
Right.
Because and you can do it, in congregation with lots of other people, but it's hard to remember that, you're each independent individual practitioners.
Ministers are frequently not fond of that concept.
Right, exactly. But these are the research findings. Yeah, so it's really funny. And it's important, for people to, at some point, be able to feel comfortable in both their capacities and their growing edges in that regard. All right, slide 6. What are optimal neuro environments for a life lived as art? Okay, so here's a neuroscientist, Greg Dunn. And what he's discovered is through his peerings into electron microscopes that what he was actually deciding he was seeing was art. And so these aren't actual photographs, these are drawings and paintings that he's done based on what he's seen under his microscope, right? And I just find this stuff really fascinating. Here's another one. And he's got a website, if you put his name in the... So this is a case where he's basically taken his life's work, how he earns a living, and he's followed the urge as best he can to turn it into art and to find a way to express it as art. I think for many of us who love the work we do, we're inherently always trying to do that. The years that I spent as a house builder, I was always trying to improve the quality of the houses I built and the way I did them and the way I felt about them. And so this would be the call or the invitation. How can we use our brain, grow connections in our brain, use those connections to help us learn to regulate those times when our arousal may get too high and keep us or turn us away from something that might extend or enhance our way in the world as a artistic enterprise, and to keep practicing. I'm sure these pictures that we're looking at were not Greg's first attempts to get these things on canvas. All right, let's see what's next. Slide 7. What's the role of attentional intelligence in our artistic life? All right. So what is attentional intelligence, first of all? Any guesses? Okay. No guesses. That's fine.
Sorry.
So basically what it means is an increasing capacity to direct our attention where we want it to go, when we want it to go there. And oftentimes it seems simple and automatic, but other times it's really not. Particularly when we have intrusive thoughts that make us feel bad. Right? I spend a lot of time trying to grow the neurons in my brain that make it easy for me to observe when those kinds of thoughts show up and to not let them take charge. Right? So anytime you're trying to do something new, like offer this course here or the course in narrative medicine, which is our first debut, there's this constant recurring stream of directives called thoughts telling you all the ways it could be better, right? It's not good enough. And so artistic and attentional intelligence then becomes a way of learning and growing the capacity to not necessarily shut those thoughts down or close them off, shut them up, but to just watch them as they surface. Sort of like Jill Bolte Taylor describes when her language centers were coming back online. She says, I really thought it was fascinating until I realized they firmly expect me to believe them. Which we often end up doing, right? We believe the bad things we tell ourselves.
Yep. On a regular basis.
So that's a clue for me. When I start feeling bad about something, it's almost like a little reminder signal goes off. Said, that one got you. That one convinced you to believe it. And it's tricky because, oftentimes the things we think in that regard really are offering up good suggestions. Right? Like one of the things I was thinking about this presentation that we just did is, we really need to have more non-didactic time. And I also think that about, this presentation. It would be great to be able to incorporate some exercises into it that really demonstrate what I'm mostly talking about. I haven't quite figured out how to effectively do that. But it's worth paying attention to. So I put this illustration in here. I don't know if I'm guessing you can see it on your screen. So it's Kiki and Booba.
Yeah, they go back and forth.
So when you ask people, to pick and choose which is Kiki and which is Booba, almost universally, people will pick. Which one do you think they'll pick as Kiki?
The rounded one.
And which one Booba?
The star one.
I'd probably say the opposite.
Exactly. Right. Well, here's what's interesting. They actually polled a huge population of people, and it turns out that 98% of the people would choose the way Elaine and I would. So, Ruth, you know where that puts you.
Yeah, out in the cold again.
Out there on the edges. Yeah. Yeah, so, but this is a sort of like, this is an example of attentional intelligence in artistic life. So 98% of the people would think of Kiki and Booba as Kiki on the left, Booba on the right. Well, what makes it interesting then is to be able to, consider the opposite, right? And to think, I mean, I don't like the term think outside the box, but just to think in ways that are antithetical to how we customarily operate in the world, right? And as we increase our capacity for attentional intelligence, being able to choose what to think about and how to respond to what we think about, some really interesting things begin to happen. Really interesting possibilities begin to just sort of surface into consciousness. All right. So this is also an example of what's called cross-modal abstraction, the brain linking visual and auditory maps, right? So Booba sounds to 98% of us like the image on the right when we say the word. And Kiki sounds like the image on the left to most of us when we say the word. So these are visual and auditory map linkages, right? What I described earlier in the phantom limb pain was an example of muscular and visual cross-modal abstractions, linkages. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have this enormous, in my experience, untapped capacity for beginning to grow to actually grow like a muscle, the places in our brain that allow us to be able to attend to things we really want to attend to with consistency and with consistency, and it's like keep coming back to it over and over again, which is essentially what I think art often is in life. It's hanging in with stuff even after you've maybe had to put it down for a while. For me, the house building process was a great metaphor for so much of how creative enterprise unfolds. So you essentially have an idea, you want to build something, you either do it yourself or you get somebody else to do it, draw up a plan of approach and vision, try to make the vision concrete. And then day by day you go out and you take the steps that need to be taken to create what it is you're envisioning. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So Ruth, you were around when we had this vision for putting an office addition on the house.
I was.
Yeah. And you got to see, step by step by step, just what had to happen. You had to make sure that visitors to the job site didn't fall through the floor. You might remember that.
I wore a hard hat.
And wear a hard hat. Exactly. Right. And then eventually, by doing whatever you can, day by day by day, eventually what you're envisioning comes into creation. So that's another example of attentional intelligence. All right. Let's see what else is on here. Might this effective brain-mind hold a key to how we make metaphor, language, and abstract thought? I think it is, actually. And those are really useful tools for bringing art into creation, into being. All right, so this is something I just, so on slide 8, you should be seeing a domino with way too many dots. All right? And there's going to be 6 slides here that illustrate this domino. And I thought about taking this out because it's so many slides and it's only tangentially applies to this presentation, but I just couldn't do it because I think it's so cool. All right. So, Ruth, since you've
Yes.
already identified yourself as one of the 2% in the culture, when you look at these domino dots, do any of them seem like they're depressed or raised?
Yes, the ones on the right are depressed and the ones on the left are raised.
Raised. Okay. How about you, Elaine?
Well, they started out that way, but you know, it depends on where my head is,
Uh-huh.
the angle at which I look at it.
That's often true about everything.
Right.
Okay,
So
so
now the ones on the right look depressed, and the ones on the left have a little raised.
yeah. Okay, so this is what's really interesting. So the brain we've identified 108 biases that affect the brain, mostly without us being aware of them. All right? And this is a graphic illustration of one of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you, and I'm going to do at the same time, to click through the next few slides, and it's going to turn the domino, right? We're going to rotate it, all right? You see it rotating?
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to come back up in the horizontal position in slide 14, right?
Mine's not moving.
Are you in full screen mode?
I think so. I thought I was. It is now.
Okay. So you get to slide 14, and what do you see?
The same thing.
The same thing. Do you see the same thing, Elaine?
Oh, yeah, you're right. It's the same thing.
Okay, it's the same thing. So here's what's really interesting about this. We rotated the domino, and it's the same thing. And the reason it's the same thing, the reason we see raised bumps on the left and depressed bumps on the right, is because the brain has a built-in bias. And if we click one more slide, you'll probably be able to see the bias in operation. We're not going to rotate, we're going to flip it. All right? So did it flip?
Yep.
And now what do you see?
The opposite.
The opposite, right? So the dots on the right are now raised, and the dots on the left are now depressed. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's why I kept this in, why I think it's so cool. Because it demonstrates a bias that we have built in that I didn't even realize I had. And the bias that's built in that we all have, most of us have, is that light always comes from overhead. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
So if you imagine a lamp or the sun at the top of the screen, you'll see why the dots on the right look like they're raised up and why the dots on the left look like they're depressed. Because we always think of light as coming from above us. And that built-in bias is what gives the illusion. I mean, this is just a one-dimensional or two-dimensional depiction on a flat screen, right? But it presents us with the illusion of depth because of this built-in bias about light. So that's just one of 108. And the reason I put this one in because I thought it was really fun and interesting to illustrate. But if you take a look at all the other 107, it's really astonishing how much of our brain operates under our conscious awareness. And as we become more and more knowledgeable and skilled about these biases, guess what it does to attentional awareness? It profoundly increases it. You're never going to look at something similar to this again without thinking about this bias that you bring to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd never seen this illustration before. It was really fascinating to me. All right. So, attentional intelligence. What role can social neuroscience play in artistic life? Slide 15. So now making a differentiation here between social neuroscience and neuroscience in general. So practice the golden rule of social neuroscience. And I know you both remember the golden rule of social neuroscience, but just in case you don't, I put a link there at the bottom. And I'm going to remind you again. So the golden rule of social neuroscience is it takes a more organized brain to help organize a less organized brain. So Ruth, what you described doing at Davidson is exactly a practice of the golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
These students coming out to hang out with you 4 times a year, whenever, was them being exposed to your more organized brain and helping to organize theirs. Me being apprenticed to a journeyman carpenter when I was 19 years old was an example of the mentoring process where my disorganized brain was being organized by his more organized brain to be able to actually become a skilled house builder myself. Right? So more and more we've lost the apprenticeship mentoring model in the culture. When I was working at the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, ITP, and we first inaugurated our programs there, they were built around the mentor model. And that model I found to be enormously enlivening and exciting and actual fun, because it allowed me to both mentor people, but also to learn from the mentoring. Right? It's a reciprocal process. And I got exposed to all kinds of interesting people. So, for example, one of my students was a lawyer, and he decided that he wanted to investigate the effects of entheogens, which are God drugs, like ayahuasca or mescaline or peyote, and because it's illegal in the United States, he would fly down to Brazil to experiment with it. And then he'd come back and he'd do his, he'd write up his research. And it turned out that I learned a tremendous amount about how this drug is used in religious ceremonies. And then his research was taken by lawyers who were defending a case before the Supreme Court, and it was entered into evidence as confirmation that this is a viable practice in people's religious ceremonies. So that was, that was a result of me being intimately involved in the mentoring process with this student that I never would have had knowledge of or exposure to probably any other way. But that mentor model went away because, lots of different reasons, mostly political. And we don't do that anymore at the school. So that's mostly why I'm not there. Because I do think this is an extraordinarily powerful way to learn. And if I was just starting school right now, this is how I would approach my learning. I'd find somebody who was doing what I wanted to learn how to do, and I'd go just hang out with them. Actually, I just read some interesting research this morning. How College Works is the name of the book. And what they said is they interviewed tons of students who'd finished college, and they asked them what was the one thing they remember from college. And almost universally they said, I met a professor who profoundly impacted me, often in a mentor role, but not necessarily. Yeah, one person they just really deeply connected with. And so this is a basic premise of social neuroscience, right? People who have more organized, knowledgeable brains than ours can profoundly influence ours. So here's what a mentor does for us. They provide recognition. They see us repeatedly and accurately in a positive light. They extend encouragement. They inspire us to take heart when we inevitably lose it. So I can give you a quick example of that. So my first day on a framing crew, Southern California, we're building apartment buildings, putting up the walls with studs and joists and things. And to be cool on a framing crew, you have to use what's called a rigging axe, because that's what framers use. And it's an axe with a hatchet blade on one side and a waffle-faced hammer on the other side. And the reason the face is waffle-faced so that you can hit a nail and the nail won't slip. So when you hit it, when you're really skilled at this, you can hit a 3.5 inch long nail into a 2x4 in 2 hits. So my first day on the job, almost like within the first hour, I smashed my thumb with the rigging axe. And the waffle face on a rigging axe doesn't need to take a lot of pressure to take off big chunks of skin. So that's a big owie, right? Well, 5 minutes later, I do the same thing to the same thumb all over again.
Oh.
And this was, at that point, I was ready to stop learning this craft. But a couple guys came over and they said, yep, there it is. It's the first day on the job. We could have told you that would happen. They got some first aid stuff and put it on, wrapped it up, and encouraged me to keep hanging in there, right? Okay. So then finally, or next is offers facilitation. It's helpful to have someone skilled and knowledgeable who can calm the waters or tend to boo-boos and provide clear, accurate direction during tough times. Rigging axe bashed thumbs will heal. And then finally, encourages stretching. This is probably the most important piece. With discernment and care, reflect those areas where we perform poorly and help us gain mastery. And it really takes a skillful mentor to be able to convey the stretching piece without it feeling like a threat, right? Because remember, all evaluation is experienced by the body, usually outside awareness, as threat. And when the body does experience evaluation as threat, what it often does is have us turn away from those things that feel threatening. And we basically lose interest, and we make up stories about it, right? Well, I don't really want to learn how to build houses anyway, right? There are plenty of better ways. I was making more money when I was, a government contractor. So this is where the stretching encouragement really is an important role to be able to do skillfully. Right, Ruth?
Yes.
All right.
It's interesting, offshoot of having 4 years of answering the BBQ.
Right, the big brain question.
That people don't ever go away. So it's a lifetime commitment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, if you can answer the big brain question for people, and it's true for me as a mentor, students that I've mentored 10, 15 years ago still periodically come up here to Whitby and hang out for, just to catch up. Because I love to hear what they're doing and how their lives are going. All right, slide 16. What role can social neuroscience play in artistic life? We've seen that question before. So, practice the protege effect. Elena Ruth, do either of you know what that might be?
Oh, I should. I should remember that.
Not necessarily, because it's actually a pretty new...
No, I read it.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, it's the protege effect is what I'm doing here.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
You learn when you teach.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I was thinking of Piaget.
The Piaget effect.
The protege, okay.
Yeah, the Piaget effect. I mean, he probably actually was doing that as well, the protege effect, Piaget.
Yeah, yeah.
So what I've discovered is that teaching something I really want to learn is a powerful way to organize and present what it is that I want to learn. Because it forces me to go as deeply as I can into things in ways that I really understand them so that I can convey them to other people. And if other people are having difficulty with my conveying, then it's my responsibility to find newer and more clear and more succinct ways to actually present what I'm offering and trying to learn. So the protege effect we teach in service to our own learning, okay? And when we have that intention, learning really changes in our internal experience of it. You know, it really becomes exciting, at least for me. And so here's an interesting experiment that folks have done. So if you keep clicking, you'll see a little slide that is called Betty's Brain. And so Betty's Brain is the result of something that information technology people have come up with to create teachable agents. And so these are computerized characters who can actually learn. And it's the students, and they put Betty's Brain with elementary school students. And the elementary school students' job is to teach Betty. And when they compare kids who've worked with teachable agents, like Betty, against kids who are just learning in the customary ways with teacher teaching, the kids who work with teachable agents learn much faster and more deeply than kids who don't. And they experience this thing in Hebrew is called nachas, which means pride and satisfaction derived from someone else's accomplishments. So we're not just learning for ourselves by ourselves. We're learning, in addition, we're learning and teaching so that other people can benefit and accomplish learning. So like I hear Ruth say, how valuable knowing about and practicing the big brain question for 4 years has been. And then my right hand goes up and I say, yeah! Because that was a really important thing for me to learn, right? And to learn about the brain's needs for it.
It's really interesting to recognize that intuitively that happened, and until I took this course I didn't understand what it was.
Yeah.
I just knew that it worked.
Yeah.
That it was what came naturally.
Right. It's really important for us to feel felt by other people accurately and to get or have that reflected back to us. It's how we learn who we are in the world. And when we don't have people around us who can serve that function, it really has an adverse impact on our brains. All right, slide 17. How can we become even more skillful cognitive misers? What do you think that's about? So essentially, it's about limitation of the brain, and that is the fact that it's not an infinite resource, and that is that it uses energy, and that is that it wants to conserve its energy in any way that it can. And so often, the way it conserves energy is to try to avoid doing hard work. Right? To do our best to take shortcuts and to, take things at face value and not do the work required, because it actually takes neurons firing action potentials, expending energy to think about things deeply. And in some sense, it's a lot more complex than that, but in some sense, the fact that we continually get as nations into these disorganized states called, recessions and wars and things like that are a consequence of, brains not being sufficiently developed to think things through and to think about things like unintended consequences and to see big picture possibilities. I think I've mentioned before, the people who develop these financial products on Wall Street actually had good ideas, and their intentions were actually good. What they were trying to do was develop debt instruments that would minimize risk. But they couldn't foresee how these, how bundling together housing mortgages in big batches that contained lots of mortgages that people couldn't really pay could bring down the whole financial system. Those dots were just too hard to connect because they don't operate in an environment that encourages that kind of analysis or deep thinking. All right. How can we become even more skilled cognitive misers? Slide 17 is a quote from Phil Jackson. Always keep an open mind and a compassionate heart. Yeah, that's a great directive, and not one, it's actually one I have had to increasingly grow into. It doesn't come pre-loaded as my own personal software.
A learning curve, huh?
Big one in many instances. Okay, slide 18. What's a primary fundamental requirement for a life lived as art? Strengthening our yes circuitry. What do you think that's about?
Being open.
Yeah. Being open. Taking a look at, those things we just reactively say no to out of fear or cognitive miserliness or attentional disintelligence. Just be curious about, why did I say no to that, right? What's really interesting about this quote-unquote yes circuitry is that this is something that gets laid down in childhood. If we have parents who are able to actually answer the big brain question for us in terms of helping regulate hyperarousal, especially around new things, and who don't get hyperaroused themselves when kids take on new things, new growth and learning, then actual circuits in the brain begin to form that promote risk-taking, healthy risk-taking, right? And risk-taking becomes a great fun adventure. But again, all of these have to do with how early development affects the connections that brain cells actually make. So that's the yes circuitry, and these are actual circuits in the brain that we can develop at any age, but it's great if they're developed in childhood. And then the other possibility is strengthening, slide 19, our nose circuitry. There's another circuit that gets put down early in children's brains. And it's really interesting to me, particularly the nose circuitry. So parents are required to walk this really narrow line between yes and no with their kids, right? It's really easy for parents to be over-restrictive and mostly do what they need to do to manage their own reactivity and their own discomforts around kids' growth and learning. But if you don't have somebody around to actually say no when no needs to be said, you don't grow your nose circuitry. So here's how I found this, both where and how I found about this circuitry. I think I mentioned it last time. I'm reading this book by Mark Lewis called Memoirs of an Addicted Brain. So he was a longtime drug addict who started in the 60s and was addicted to everything from cocaine to heroin to glue to sugar to anything you can think of. And then he managed to get clean after many repeated failures. And he decided to turn his life into art, and he became a neuroscientist. And his research, as is often the case, turned into me-search. He wanted to find out what goes on, what went on in my brain that turned me into an addict. And essentially what he discovered is that he didn't have the requisite no circuitry in his brain that would allow him to simply say no to drugs. Because drugs made him feel good in ways that normal life did not. Because of other circuitry that he was missing, like the ability to calm himself down and the ability to organically and naturally fire dopamine circuitry in his brain. So I highly recommend his book. He's a really good writer. He was a English undergraduate, and he just gives you an account of all the ways that being addicted to anything actually affects your neurophysiology and what it takes to begin to address that. And it takes other people, essentially, and it has nothing to do with willpower. It actually turns out that addicts' brains work harder, exponentially harder than normal people's brains because of what the craving for the drugs actually do to the brain. That's why it's partly why so many people addicted to drugs are so emaciated, because they're just expending so much energy all the time, both in the pursuit and in the use of these substances. All right, let's see, slide 20. Know your own no. So on slide 19 again, at the very last part on this slide, I have this phrase, which I've written a few blogs about, the ordo amorum. Remember that, Ruth? Elaine?
I remember the slide. I'm not familiar with ordo amorum.
Okay, good. So ordo amorum is a Latin phrase. It basically means the order of our loves.
Ah. The what?
The order
The order of our loves?
of our loves. So here's what this is referring to, basically. So we have finite capacities. We have finite time on the planet. We have finite time in the day. We have finite energy, finite neural resources, real estate, connectivity in our brain. And what Ordo Amor essentially is saying is that because of this reality, this physical, organic reality, we have this requirement upon us when we wake up to it to begin to separate and attend to the things in our lives and discriminate the things in our lives between what we love and what we love most. Because we don't have the time to attend to every single alluring distraction that comes along in our lives, to go deeply into them. So we need to begin this winnowing process. And I mean, it was a really disheartening day when I realized that, I need to actually narrow down my field of interest. And start, deliberately thinking about and prioritizing what it is I'm going to pay and devote my attentional intelligence to. And so high on the list for my own Ordo Amorum is helping to relieve suffering in the world. And my pursuit and, landing here at Brain Science is sort of like the place where I've gotten to with that pursuit. Understanding how my brain works has made a really big difference in alleviating much of my own suffering. And for other people, too, that I know. So does Ordo Amor make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's often not easy because it requires us to actually be
Selective.
to be really selective in where our attention goes every day. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Ruth.
That's a hard one.
It is a hard one because the world's full of alluring distractions.
Yeah. That's a practice.
It is absolutely a practice. It is a practice, and one of the things that we can do is to use our body as a signaling device when we might be going off track. Our body will often tell us as we develop increasing capacity to pay attention to it.
Could you say more about that? It would tell us as in it would get tight or it would feel not right?
Yeah, exactly. So I can give you a really good example from my own life. I used to, when I was actually before I became a house builder, I had this little company that did government contracting. And the job was to build parts for airplanes. And then we used to have government inspectors come into our plant to inspect the parts we made. Well, over time, I began to notice that I had lots of headaches all the time. And just before an inspection was scheduled, I would develop blisters on my fingers, these little water-filled pustules on my fingers. And essentially, in retrospect, I didn't realize it at the time, my body was telling me that what I was actually doing was not a good fit for me, for many, many reasons. And it was after I then got out of that business that both the headaches went away and the blisters went away. And I have never had them since.
Wow.
Yeah. So oftentimes our body will send us messages, and then our work is to begin to act with curiosity and like Inspector Columbo and try to figure out, just what the message actually is. Another example briefly is, for a period in my life, I was plagued with uncontrollable diarrhea. It was really limited my functioning in the world. And it turned out that, there were some changes I needed to make in the way I was leading a really stressful life, and my body was letting me know.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe both of you are familiar with Louise Hay's book.
Yes.
Yeah. So she's essentially saying, your body tells you tons of stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And we need to actually honor and listen to it and take contingent communication, do contingent communication with our bodies, and respond in a timely and effective manner. Yeah. All right. Slide 20. Any questions? Okay. Doesn't sound like it.
Well,
Go ahead.
I mean, it might be kind of just sort of too far off, but I've been thinking about just the way people eat and, the way brain chemistry is really either supported or not supported by what you're putting in your body.
Right.
So it just seems like you have to really want to make this change. And you can't, I guess I'm thinking of people that I really love won't change the way they eat, but it doesn't seem to be, do you know what I mean? So
well, I do know what you mean, since it's one of my, it's one of the things at the top of my ordo amorem. Be more mindful in my eating. So I'm actually working on a a presentation called "How a Neuroscientist Loses Weight."
Oh.
But I can't deliver it until I actually lose the weight, right? Because I want to be authentic in the actual presentation. So I've been researching a lot about it, and I look at two things that I think are critical. Well, there's probably many more, and then I'll find out what they are, but two things seem to be critical. One is, you obviously do have to want to lose it, but that cognitive awareness and intention really isn't enough, right? So it's clear to me that based on my early childhood, with very little supervision and a lot of neglect, I don't have really strong no circuitry installed in certain areas, right? So part of how we increase and improve the strength of our no circuitry is we willingly give ourselves over to other people to help us with it. Preferably people who themselves have strong no circuitry.
Right.
Because if you start hanging out with people that love sweets and special treats, then you're going to be having to work a lot extra hard to accomplish this goal, right? So establishing no circuitry is one, and then getting other people's help's another. And then the third piece that I think is probably really critical is your environment. So, for example, this weekend I spent the whole weekend at Bastyr University, which is a naturopathic doctor training place, and I ate my meals there, and for 2 days I had totally healthy meals because that was the environment that I was operating in, and it was fine, right? And I didn't even give it much thought. It was time to eat. We go to the cafeteria, we get the food, Sit down, eat, and we're done. So that was a piece of it. And the other piece of it was for those 2 days, I was occupied by what I was doing, deeply immersed and engaged in what I was doing, and food didn't even come up as an issue or a topic. Right? It's sort of like those times when the brain is lax, or, you just mindlessly take things to eat.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a work in progress, and I'm expecting probably by the end of this year to be able to authentically report on what actually works, based on my knowledge of how the brain works and my own personal explorations. All right, slide 21. What are Ramachandran's 9 laws of neuroaesthetics? So I thought this was really... So here's a picture on slide 21 of what's his full name? Vladimir Subramanian Ramachandran, Marco Polo of neuroscience. So he's one of my favorite neuroscientists. He's just really creative and dynamic, and he's from India, and he managed to find his way here and become a doctor, and specializes in neuroscience. And he's just really personable and funny and fun. He's got a number of TED Talks, which I wholeheartedly encourage you to listen to a few. And he's written a couple books. The last one, the one I've taken this series from, is called The Telltale Brain. And he's really interested in art. He's come up with what he calls his 9 laws of neuroaesthetics. And it's basically how the brain works in response to art. All right? And on this page is an illustration done by Tanya Henderson, and one of his students who did these illustrations of him, which are kind of fun, that I thought I'd put up there. All right. So we look at slide 21, the last animation here, shows you the 9 laws. The law of grouping, law of peak shift, law of contrast, law of isolation, the peekaboo law, law of coincidence abhorrence, law of orderliness, the law of symmetry, and the law of metaphor. So I just want you to know these, that they exist, and briefly we're going to cruise through them, all right? Because they're really interesting. Law of grouping. So basically the brain's organized so that it sees things in groups. So if you look at this first image in the law of grouping, what you see are black and white, splotches on a screen. But then you look more closely and you begin to see how the brains and the eyes' tendency to group things begins to let us see a Dalmatian in there, right? So at first glance it might not show up, but as you look more closely, what the brain will do is it will pick it out, because that's how the law of grouping works. If you click it again, you'll see something similar with the image in the straw, right? First, you don't necessarily see it, but looking more closely, what you begin to see is there's a lion in there. You see that?
Yeah.
So this is really important for survival. The brain's ability to group things and pay attention to things that stand out like this, right? And so as we've developed artistic capacities, this becomes a way of doing art and understanding how art might work and how we group things. Both for the artistic expression of it and for engaging people's interest in the art we create. All right, second one, law of peak shift. So the law of peak shift pertains to features of an environment or of a work of art that draw our attention to it readily, all right? So the example I first put on is how a red dot put on the, or that actually is on the beak of this bird is immediately attended to by its offspring, right? And then if you look at how people do caricatures, you see peak shift in action in that artists who do caricatures take features and exaggerate them. So the first one here is Einstein. So you see his cheeks and his mustache exaggerated and his hair exaggerated. And even with that exaggeration, you can readily recognize who it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same one with the next picture. I'm blocking out her name right now. She was in The Black Swan.
Natalie
Portman. Yeah, so here's Natalie
I
Portman.
couldn't figure out who she was.
Yeah. Well, now that I tell you her name, it becomes obvious, right? You know, her lips are exaggerated, her cheeks are exaggerated, her eyes are exaggerated, you know, in ways that, you know, knowing her, if you know her, then you know this is her. So this is how peak shift works in artistic expression, according to Ramachandran. And then the last one is somebody that you'll recognize who's juxtaposed with a wig. You recognize him, right, Ruth?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I was alive.
Who wouldn't recognize the
Right, the Duke.
Yeah.
All right. So again, you know, this is an exaggeration of how we characteristically think of, you know, somebody that we know well, right? And then finally, to illustrate peak shift, I've got the statue in here of Indian goddess Saraswati. And, you know, you can see her hips are made extra thin and her breasts are really full. And she's got extra arms to symbolize, you know, her many capacities, right? So this is an artistic exaggeration to illustrate certain features the artist wanted to convey, using peak shift to actually do it. Slide 24, number 3, the law of contrast. So the first image on this is a staircase made out of sheer fabric, right? In contrast to this empty room. So, you know, this, because of where it's placed and the high contrast, it totally stands out, right? It's the first thing you see. The next one shows a floor being supported by little men. You see it? Little army men there? Yeah. So this is an unexpected contrast that you wouldn't expect to find walking across a floor, right? So great art relies on conscious contrast. The juxtaposition of light and color creates edges and boundaries and figures against ground. So this is literally figures, little toy soldiers, or men. I guess they're just men looking at it. Maybe there's a few women in there that you wouldn't expect to see under the floor you're walking on, right? And if you were to actually be walking on this floor, I would almost predict you'd be walking with your head down, looking at all these little characters, seeing if any of them might be moving. All right, so that's the law of contrast. Next is the law of isolation. So here's 3 depictions of a horse and a horse and rider. One is by Da Vinci. Another, the number A, is done by a highly skilled child with autism. And the number C is done by someone who is age appropriate, same age as the person with autism who doesn't have that skill. And so what Ramachandran's depicting in this law is how overlapping neural networks constantly compete for attentional resources, right? I just want to make a ancillary comment about this. So in today's world, with so much data and information constantly streaming into our lives, it's really taxing our attentional resources. Have you noticed that? I mean, every day I probably get somewhere between 100 and 150 emails.
Wow.
So taking a weekend off, I come back and there's like 300 emails.
Wow.
Right? Well, this is something related to the Ordo Amorum. We really need to begin to pay less and less and more focused attention to things that have the greatest heart and meaning for us.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have limited attentional resources.
Mm-hmm.
So how Ramachandran's talking about this is he's talking about in terms of art and how the visual cortex responds to things. And our eyes care mostly about lines, because that's what they mostly see. You know, we have neurons for seeing horizontal lines, neurons for seeing curved lines, neurons for seeing diagonal lines. And so the rods and cones in our eyes see these different lines, send signals to the visual cortex in the brain, and that area of the brain then works as a compiler and puts all these things together, sends signals back to the eye to check and see, to do a veracity check, to see if it's accurately representing what it's seeing, and then comes back, and eventually we end up seeing the full image. And it happens in microseconds, right? And we're never aware that we're seeing things piecemeal because it happens so quickly and so efficiently. But all you have to do is take a few drugs, a few entheogens, and you begin to see how differently it's possible for the brain to see things. Right? Or watch a good illusionist do stage illusions. And you begin to see how much you don't actually see. Mm-hmm. So the eyes also respond most strongly to boundaries and edges, caring little about internal feature poor fill. The law of isolation. So then let's go to 26. Peekaboo law. We can often make things more compelling by making them suggestive. We prefer suggestive concealment because the brain is hardwired to solve puzzles. So we have a few pictures that suggest things rather than make them explicit, right? If you scroll through the pictures, you'll see illustrations of that. And often, it's sexual suggestion that's so often used in advertising, right? It's never explicit. Yeah. And then the last one is of a tree that looks like it's buried a person, grown up over a person. And so the brain is basically organized to see things in this way, right? Imagery suggests things to us that may or may not be accurate. How many times have people reported visions of Mary Magdalene or Christ in some natural object?
A sweet potato.
Yeah, a sweet potato, right?
She's such a witch.
Yeah.
It's big here.
Right. So an invitation here on this slide 26 is to be more mysterious and less transparent, perhaps. All right?
Wow.
We look at slide 27, the law of coincidence abhorrence. The brain abhors what he calls suspicious coincidences. And so on this slide where you see the tiger, what a suspicious coincidence would be to the brain is if this tiger showed up in the middle of this picture. And so professional photographers, one of the first things they learn is you never put an image in the center of your viewfinder because it just looks suspicious. You'll notice most professional photographs have images that are offset, off-center. Look at the sharks in the next picture. You'll see, it's not in the center of the screen. The spider in the next one, right, is set off to the right. Flowers in the next one, again, off to the right. If they showed up in the center, they wouldn't be as compelling because the brain would identify them as suspicious coincidences. And then finally the snake. His jaws are in the center, but his whole body's taking up the whole left side of the screen. So as photographers make art, this is one of the things that they're either trained in or they become aesthetically aware about, right? Stay away from anything that looks suspicious. And then the last image of this woman with the blue eye, again, set off to the right. Experiment with being a little off-center in your own life. Right, Ruth? The law...
It's one of the permissions of getting older.
Right. And being a member of the 98% club. Slide 7, the law of orderliness. All right, so in this one, what do you see when you look at the first slide? What's immediately noticeable? So there's a picture on the wall.
Oh, it's off. It's skewed.
Yeah, exactly.
I would be pushing the corner.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So the law of orderliness is that our brain is drawn to the fact that this thing is not parallel with either the walls or the ceiling, right? And the urge is to move it so that it actually is in good order with its environment. Next one is a picture of people's teeth, right? You can almost feel a visceral response to the teeth on the bottom. You see them?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're disorganized and yeah. Whereas the teeth on the left are much more pleasing to the eye.
Very orderly.
Right. Again, we look at this image of how the brain distorts our perception, looking for orderliness. So if we look at this image of these lines and boxes, it looks like the lines aren't parallel, right? It looks like they're thinner on one end, and fatter on the other end, on the horizontal lines. Doesn't it?
It does.
Right. But in fact, if you put a ruler on the screen, you'll see that every one of those lines is exactly parallel. So the brain's search for orderliness in this case has been corrupted by those by those red and white disordered boxes there. So this is one way that a violation of the law of orderliness can distort our perception. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, we have this sort of saying or this belief that we only can believe what we see, but the reality is often we cannot. For lots of reasons, mostly about how the brain actually works with what it does see, and the biases that are inherent. And the final image is a picture of a hand. You see it there?
Mine's coming up slowly.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, that's...
Yeah, so there's a hand. You look at that hand, what's your immediate response?
Pain.
Yeah.
Yeah, something's wrong.
Something's really wrong here. I think I mentioned that I almost cut my finger off 2 years ago, and my little finger looked a lot like that one. Yeah. So the law of orderliness, it really informs our experience of what looks good and feels good to our brain. The need for regularity may reflect a deeper need of our visual system for economy of processing. It's much harder to process and takes more internal resources to process an image like this than one that's, a perfectly normal hand. We wouldn't even look again, right? Identify the places where more order might benefit your life. I'm laughing because this is something I'm constantly doing in my own life, trying to bring more order to it. And it's a practice, right? This is an aside, but I used to have a friend that I worked with, and she was a financial officer, and every day she'd come to work and she'd do her work, and at the end of the day, she'd leave her office and there would not be a single shred of paper or anything at all on top of her desk.
Oh, that's me.
And I was just amazed at this. So one day, I asked, I said, Jane, I noticed that, every day when you go home, your desk is perfectly clear. And she said, really? Oh, well, isn't that just what you do? And so for her, it was effortless, right? It was just something that she did. It didn't take a lot of thought. It didn't take, extra energy or anything. She had just developed this capacity for orderliness as a reflection of her internal state, which was nothing like mine. So this is something that I'm constantly developing a practice for, right? And I enlist help. There's a computer program called Follow Up Then, and basically what you do is you type in an instruction. So for example, I have an instruction that says clear off your desk. So it's serving as an external prompt, and once a week it gets sent to me. It's a free service. Once a week it gets sent to me to remind me, clear off your desk.
Is it helping?
Well, here's what happens. It stays in my inbox until I actually clear off my desk. And when I want to finally get rid of it, I just make the time to spend 5 minutes, whatever it takes, to clean off my desk. So it is helping, and it actually feels good to have a clean desk, because then I can totally focus on only what's in front of me.
Yep.
Right? When my desk is messy, there's all kinds of things on it that are constantly vying for my cognitive miserliness and my limited attentional resources and intelligence. All right. Identify places where more order might benefit your life. And then identify places where less order might benefit your life. And walk the narrow line between them. All right. The law.
Know which is which.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So the law of symmetry is number 8. And we can see it in this first image where an artist has basically drawn a wooded scene over a lake. And, there's for me at least, there's a lot of enormous visual appeal to this scene. Right? So we look again at the next image. It's like a kaleidoscope of faces. And again, it's just really, I'm just like really drawn into this image. Next one is a geometric pattern of berries. And again, it just feels really compelling to my brain. And then the final image shows Beyonce, or not Beyonce, but Rihanna with her normal face. And then what if you take one half of her face and flip it over to make a whole face, you'll see how different symmetry works. So I did one with Brian Williams, the newscaster, and when you do it with his face, you can't even tell it's him in the two different symmetries. With Rihanna, you can actually see that it's really her in both of these images. So it's just been really interesting for me to look at people's lack of symmetry in their own faces. And what I suspect, actually, is a lot of that asymmetry in people's faces may be a consequence of early childhood development. Be interesting to do a research project on that. Our preference for symmetry is largely unconscious, rooted in our evolutionary avoidance of parasites and disease. This is Ramachandran's perspective on symmetry. Where in your life might you make conscious choices to go against the law of symmetry? All right, and finally, the law of metaphor. So here's a series of images that make suggestive use of artistic medium to create visual metaphors. So in this first one, we see water suggesting a dress, right? You see it there?
Barely.
Right. The next one, we see an image of a smoker and its impact on a baby inside the mouth there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's a pretty compelling, I want to say, aversive image. We wouldn't even ever think of, letting a baby smoke, and yet how many people smoke around their children?
Yeah.
My mother certainly did. And then the next image is simply a heart laying in a bed of ice, right? And that creates a certain image and metaphor. How might you install compelling visual metaphors into your own life? All right, so those are Ramachandran's 9 laws of neuroaesthetics. All right? Basically, he's just looking at things that are hardwired into most of our brains and make us understand and respond to art. And knowing them, then we have permission to actually begin to work around them and through them and outside them. Because we understand them. And then, so looking at the next image here, I've just listed this list of creative traits from Csikszentmihalyi's book, Creativity. And so what he did is he went out and he interviewed and looked at the work and lives of 91 eminent artists. And he came up with these 13 things that are common to each of them, which I thought were really interesting. So one is energy and drive, and yet sleeps a lot. Smart yet naive. Playful yet disciplined. Imaginative yet rooted in reality. A lot of these are juxtapositions, right? Introverted yet extroverted. Shy yet assertive. Male yet female. Tolerant of ambiguity. Rebellious yet conservative. Willing to take risks. Passionate yet objective. Aware of the importance of luck. Not interested in past accomplishments. And sensitivity to pain and loss. So these are interesting traits, and when I think about them, look at this list like this, what they mostly tell me or suggest to me is neural integration. Growing, increasing capacities in our brain in ways that represent growth and increased connectivity. To make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Living life and art as art requires us to spend time in green spaces. Moving to Whidbey Island, I have to say, really drove this point home to me more than it ever had. When I lived in California, I spent a lot of time in national parks there, like Big Basin and Huddard Park on the peninsula and out at the beaches. And it really became clear to me that natural environments have a profound capacity to regulate my nervous system. And mostly to bring it to a sense of healthy homeostasis. Every day I make it a point to spend some time out in the woods around here. All right.
Isn't that Japan where they actually will write you a prescription to go to a forest, or you have to, you're out of alignment, you need green, so they go to a forest or spend some time.
That would be a great prescription.
Yeah.
Yeah. And report back on what the experience is like.
Yeah.
It used to be astonishing to me how when I would go over to Big Basin, so Big Basin is a forest preserve of redwoods near Santa Cruz and in the Santa Cruz Mountains, right? Yeah. It's a public preserve, and I would go there, and there'd be so few people. Once you get out of the main entrance to the park, you start walking on trails, you never see another person. And I was just always astonished. It's like, here's this extraordinary resource, and nobody's using it. Yeah, so I used it. Yeah, so I highly recommend, as part of making a life of art, to spend time in green spaces and natural spaces. Can I train myself to become a synesthete? Slide 33. Do either of you know what a synesthete is?
I don't.
Okay. So there's this condition called synesthesia. 1/3 of all writers, artists, and poets claims to have had a synesthesia experience. The gene that produces synesthesia confers a propensity toward metaphor. So basically what synesthesia is, if we click through, what we will see is a picture of the brain. And on this picture, we see how the different parts of the brain are used to process different kinds of sensory awareness. Okay? Can you see that?
I can see it now, yeah.
Yeah. So normally, in most of us, these areas are really discrete. Vision center only processes vision. Auditory cortex only processes sound. Sensory cortex only processes sensory experiences, right? Well, in synesthetes, what happens is wiring from one area of the brain that's normally not connected to other areas somehow finds its way into that area. Okay? So people can begin to hear color, for example.
Oh.
Right? Or they can smell images. Or they can see auras around people. Right? Well, these are real capacities that people have as a consequence of the way their brain has actually become wired. And people who develop it and use it in terms of their art become enormously unique in their capacities to make these connections meaningful. So, for example, there's a synesthete who's also autistic named Daniel Tammet. He says he was born on a blue day. And what he's developed is a capacity to do math using his experience of numbers relating to colors. Right? So when one of his things that he can do easily is he can recite pi to 1,000 digits accurately. And the way he does it, and the way he explains how it works, is that when he's actually reciting these numbers, he's seeing a rainbow of colors, and he's just announcing the colors he's seeing. So if you want to be an artist, this is a great way to have your genes have affected the way your brain is wiring up. And another point that I'll make is that it's possible to actually practice this in ways that produce this kind of experience more often than you might expect. Okay, so art and life. What's one main requirement, slide 34, for living life as art? So we've been over this a few times. And repetition is really great for learning things. This is Mike Evans. Remember him, ladies?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mike is the 23.5-hour guy.
Yeah.
The single best thing we can do for our health. Walk a half hour a day. So I've been doing this now ever since I first saw his video. Half hour a day, come what may. So if it's bedtime and I haven't done my half hour, guess what?
You do it? Wow.
The dog and I go for a walk in the dark with a flashlight. And I have to say, there have been a few days that I have missed, and I immediately feel it. I feel sluggish in my thinking. I feel slow. I feel it's not really fatigue. It's sort of like something is off. I've actually forgotten to do something essential. And then I remember, oh yeah, I haven't walked. So this is a great practice. And I'm sure I'm going to be including it in my How a Neuroscientist Loses Weight presentation. and most days I do go for more than half an hour, but a half hour is a minimum. And so again, to reinforce this main requirement, I put a picture of Daniel Wolpert, the Cambridge neuroscientist whose, argument is that the brain, one of the brain's primary purposes is to move the body. And anytime the body, I think we've talked about, and we'll talk about again, when we look at the last slide, actually, to reinforce it even more, Susanna Herculano Huzel's finding about what a high percentage of the neurons in the brain are devoted to physical movement. Right? So if we're not moving, then we're sending a signal to our brain that something's wrong, actually. Right? And anytime, I think we talked about this in terms of how adverse childhood experiences impact the brain, when we're unable to move, that's a huge warning signal to the brain. I love this picture of her. She's really delightful. She's done a TED Talk, too, that I would highly encourage you to listen to. I love seeing women scientists because the field is so dominated by the masculine and the linear and logical. All right. Another main requirement for living life is art. Slide 35. You recognize this guy?
Hasn't come up yet.
Is it right there?
Yeah,
Oh.
it's Rilke.
Rilke.
Yeah. So this is from his letters to a young poet, this quote. And I love this quote, and I've used it in lots of different venues and situations. And I just take out human being and put specialists in there. Like, for example, I'll say, for one lawyer to love another. For one banker to love another. For one cognitive neuroscientist to love another. That's perhaps the most difficult of all our tasks. The ultimate, the last test and proof, the work for which all other work is but preparation. This is the miracle that happens every time to those who really love. The more they give, the more they possess. Yeah. So this has been a sort of like a prime directive that I've been working a lot of my life to try to grow into. And part of this research and this presentation is a result of discovering what some of the barriers are. If we look at slide 36, we look at Rumi, who says something very similar, right? Our task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. And so my argument would be that most of those barriers, in my experience, have to do with my neurophysiology. So we look at the next animation, we see the moment where we started. Remember, we started with pre and perinatal psychology. The influence on our neurophysiology based on what was affecting and impacting our mother while we were developing. So what happens then can become either a support or a barrier. Right? The other thing we looked at is the consequences of violence and verbal abuse in early life. Right? These things all affect our capacity to love ourselves and other people. The next one is polyvagal theory. So we spent a session on that. We looked at how, the environment affects our nervous system and how neuroception and hyperarousal and the way our body responds to both the thoughts we think and actual perceived, real or perceived, threats in the environment, contract our capacity to be present and to experience love. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really hard to feel the experience of love when I'm angry or upset or frightened. We also looked at how grief impacts, especially unresolved grief, acts as a barrier within ourselves. So as we pursue this desire or impulse or invitation to live our life as art, these are many of the things that we are well served to begin to inquire into. Slide 37, we looked at attachment, how early attachment affects our neural organization and our capacity to bond or not with other people. It was really interesting at this seminar that we did this weekend. We came back, so it was 2 days, Saturday and Sunday. We did Saturday, we came back on Sunday, and the first thing I said, without even thinking about it, was just a spontaneous remark, was, so here we are again, old friends who just met each other yesterday. Because that's how it actually felt, right? And I was just reflecting on it later and said, wow, that's a really weird thing for me to say, because I usually don't feel that way. You know, I'm usually pretty conservative and apprehensive around people I've just met. But they actually did feel that way. And part of it was because they acted that way the day before in many instances and continued to act that way through the rest of the presentation. So again, in some sense, that's how I feel here on this call with you folks. You know, we've been through almost 12 sessions now, and I've gotten to know a number of you, you know, both personally and other ways. All right, so we also looked at how genes can operate as barriers and how they can also operate potentially to let down barriers through the way the environment can change the way proteins express genes, affect gene expression in our brains and bodies. Another barrier is, or a potential to work through a barrier, is how we can use interpersonal neurobiology and our awareness of it to change and shape who we think we are and who we think other people are. And it's really useful for me to feel more understanding and forgiveness for trespasses or perceived trespasses against me when I filter it through my awareness of how the brain works. Because I really honestly believe all of us are doing the very best we can in any moment. And then finally we looked at how contemplative practices can serve as a way to help us remove some of the barriers within ourselves. So my basic fundamental honest belief and experience is that there is this fundamental energy in the universe that we have given a name to, and we call it love. And that mostly what happens is the way we develop ends up building barriers to our regular experience of it. And as I mentioned earlier, that's basically the pursuit that drove Buddha to come back into and rediscover it. And then to build this whole way of beginning to pay attention, to increase attentional awareness to the point where we could actually reconnect with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So for me, living a life of art is actually to do whatever I can to encounter and find my way into, through, around, over, or under these barriers as they show up. And most often they're fear-based, and they're adrenaline and cortisol driven.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So slide 38. Resources for further exploration. The Good, the True, and the Beautiful is the first book. A neuronal approach to art. The next one is The Path of Least Resistance, which I've used for many years, actually. Robert Fritz wrote this thing, I don't know, it must be 20 years ago. And it's basically a really, so he was a musician. He used to conduct the Boston Philharmonic. Mm-hmm. And he took what he learned about creating music and applied it to creating anything in our lives, to creating this 12-series neuroscience presentation, right? Mm-hmm. And he's got a way that, that really works, and has worked for me. And then finally, Rumi's Little Book of Love. 150 poems that speak to the heart. Yeah. Oh, and then the next, oops, what was that? Yeah, I hit the wrong button. All right, so then the last one is, okay. There's a lot of extra slides on here that I just added for your viewing pleasure. So then there's Mark Lewis's Addicted Brain. And I put that on here because he just, in some ways, he encapsulates everything that we've covered for these whole 12 sessions. All right? And he's a great writer. Makes it really interesting. And then here's the image that I want to leave you with. Okay, remember this one, slide 39?
Yes.
What are lacuna and why are they important for art? So a lacuna are the term in psychiatry for these holes or these places in us that are correlated with adverse early childhood experiences. The neurologist Bob Scare calls them dissociation capsules. All right? And from the ACEs study, we know that these are the 10 that correlate highly with illness in later life. And so illness can often become a barrier to our capacity to experience and feel love. So here's the image I want to leave you with. Is what happens when we begin to address, in whatever ways feel right and appropriate for us, some of these early experiences, right? So if you keep clicking, what will happen is these things will begin to move off the screen, right? That's nice. We can just sort of watch them take their leave. We go back and we move our bodies in ways that we weren't able to at the time. We find ways to, whether it's through art or through therapy or through, creative discontent, to move in ways that result in things that energize us and make us be able to express triumphant action. And my sense is, based on my own experience, we don't really have to deal with that many of them to make a profound difference in our brain's capacity to process energy and information. And so when we think about becoming again as little children, we're essentially working to restore ourselves to this time and place before any of these unfortunate things happened. And it's possible to do. Okay, so here we are at the end.
It's been great, Mark. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're certainly welcome. It's been really valuable for me. I'm continuing to learn new stuff. And, you know, a number of you have hung in through through every session, through the whole time that, you know, we've been together. And I just really want to acknowledge and appreciate that. I don't know if I could. But yeah, so it's been great to go on this journey with you all. And I'm sorry that we're coming to a close here. But we'll probably meet again.
Yeah, you'll have to come up with something else.
Yeah.
That's right.
Or each of you will, and I'll be able to hang out in the space and take in new stuff. All right. Well, again, thanks. And
Thank you, Mark.
yeah, Ruth, absolutely. Tell me again when you're coming back to Whitby.
For Pioneers in November.
Excellent.
Yes.
All right. Well, until then, take care.
Realistic.
Take care, everyone else. All righty. And have a good night.
Thank you.
All righty. Bye for now.
Bye.